Could life exist beyond the biology we know? I mean, could something built from silicon and code truly be considered, alive?
That's a huge question.
Yeah, and that's the audacious frontier we're diving into today, this fascinating intersection where computer science meets biology, the world of artificial life.
It's a field really born from that bold question.
Mhm.
Can we understand life by creating it or something like it?
And our guide for this deep dive is a report from those early days, Artificial Life, a report from the frontier where computers meet biology. This source really takes us right back to the beginning, introduces the pioneers, the key experiments that launched this whole thing.
Right. So our mission here is to try and cut through some of the complexity, pull out the core ideas, meet those key figures, and really understand the surprising discoveries that got this field going. It's kind of a shortcut to grasping how it fundamentally challenges our definition of life.
Okay, let's unpack this. So first off, how do you even begin to define something as slippery as artificial life? It sounds almost impossible.
Well, yeah, it's less about nailing down one perfect definition and maybe more about exploring systems that exhibit life-like properties. The core idea is studying life by creating artificial systems, life in silico, in computers as information or process.
Rather than just in vitro, like in a lab with actual biological stuff.
Exactly, not just in wet chemistry.
So it's not just about building robots that, I don't know, look like dogs. It's about systems that actually act alive, that follow some of life's fundamental rules, maybe.
Precisely. And the sources highlight this distinction made early on. You've got weak A life, which uses computers to simulate known life, basically to understand biology better. Think of it like a computational microscope.
Okay, that makes sense.
But then there's the more ambitious, maybe more controversial, strong A life that aims to create alternative forms of life. Systems that could potentially be considered genuinely alive, even if they're completely different from us carbon-based units.
And they suggest we shouldn't even think of life as just like on or off, alive or not alive.
Yeah, that's a key shift the field really pushed for. Instead of the strict binary, think of life more on a continuum. A rock is way down low, a person is high up. And then you have these ambiguous systems, things with some but not all the properties falling somewhere in the middle. Viruses are the classic biological example, right? They replicate, they evolve.
But only inside a host cell.
Exactly. They need to hijack the machinery, so they're in that murky middle ground.
Which, yeah, immediately makes you wonder about things that replicate and evolve digitally. But okay, we'll get to computer viruses later. Before you can create artificial life, though, you need some kind of logical foundation, right? And that takes us back to giants like John von Neumann and Alan Turing.
Oh, absolutely foundational. Von Neumann, he viewed life through this incredibly logical lens. He saw organisms not as, messy biological stuff, but as these super complex machines. And he believed their secrets, their organization, could be unlocked through logic, not just randomness.
So he was less focused on the specific molecules and more on the underlying program, the instructions.
That's it, exactly. He saw life as a fundamentally reconstructible process, a series of events, interactions, all based on logic. And this led him to his work on self-reproducing automata, these conceptual machines.
Right, both the physical ones, like robots collecting parts.
The kinematic automata, yeah. And the more abstract ones, these patterns on a grid, cellular automata that followed rules to copy themselves. And he really built heavily on Alan Turing's ideas for this.
Turing, the father of theoretical computer science and the concept of universal computation.
Right, the Turing machine, this theoretical device that can perform any computation if you can describe it as an algorithm. And that's just crucial for A-life because it implies that a computer could potentially emulate something as complex as life itself, assuming life is a kind of computational process.
And the Turing machine, conceptually, is pretty straightforward, isn't it? You've got a tape, a head that reads and writes, and a set of rules based on its current state and what it sees on the tape.
And that head, its behavior, is essentially a finite state machine, an FSM. A basic model where what you do next depends only on where you are now, your current state, and the input you get. The source uses that great musical chairs analogy.
Oh, yeah.
Your state is in the game or out. The input is music playing or music stopped. And your rules tell you whether to walk, sit, or leave. Simple states, simple rules dictating behavior.
Okay, I get it. And how did this sort of machine perspective start getting applied to actual living biology?
Well, think back to McCulloch and Pitts in the 40s. Their work suggested the nervous system, neurons firing, could be modeled mathematically, like early artificial neural networks. Von Neumann saw this, connected it to Turing's universal machine idea.
Okay.
If a universal machine can simulate any computation, and if biological systems like nervous systems are doing computation, then maybe, just maybe, living things have a kind of built-in computer system running the show. If you can describe the process clearly enough, von Neumann argued, you can build it in a machine.
That's a really powerful idea that life is fundamentally about information processing, which leads us perfectly to the next big concept.
Yeah.
How incredibly simple rules can somehow generate staggering complexity.
Yeah, this is where cellular automata, or CAs, just captured everyone's imagination. Picture a grid, like a checkerboard. Each square, each cell, has a really simple state, maybe just on or off, alive or dead. And the state of that cell in the next tick of the clock, it depends only on its own current state and the states of its immediate neighbors, according to a tiny set of rules.
Like the most famous one, John Conway's Game of Life.
The absolute classic. Life has, just 3 incredibly simple rules governing whether a cell is born, survives, or dies based purely on how many living neighbors it has. That's it.
And from just those basic rules, you get, well, not just static patterns.
You get unbelievable complexity. Stable patterns that just sit there, but also oscillators that blink and dynamic things that move across the grid, the famous gliders.
Right.
You get complex structures that interact, patterns that grow, patterns that essentially replicate. It's astonishing.
So the profound insight from the Game of Life was... What exactly? What did it show people?
The really stunning thing was that from just 3 incredibly basic local rules applied everywhere, you got this emergent complexity. Complexity so rich, it was eventually proven that the Game of Life could simulate a universal computer itself.
Wow.
It showed the early A-Life pioneers that, yes, the universe could build incredibly complex things from the bottom up without needing a grand designer or a central controller. Complex global behavior emerging from simple local interactions.
And this wasn't just some obscure academic thing, right? The source mentions it really took off.
Oh, totally. It absolutely popularized CAs. Apparently, hackers used millions of dollars of unauthorized computer time running life simulations. There were newsletters just for sharing new patterns people found. It even led to people building specialized hardware, like Tommaso Toffoli's CAM6 machine, just to run these cellular automata really fast, giving researchers massive computational power for this kind of work relatively cheaply. And later you had people like Stephen Wolfram exploring 1D CAs, finding complex, almost random-looking patterns from simple rules, and Norman Packard simulating snowflake growth with CAs, showing this wasn't just digital weirdness, but maybe how complexity arises in nature too.
Okay, so the lesson is simple local rules, let them run, and complexity emerges. The next obvious question seems to be, can that complexity actually evolve?
And that brings us straight to John Holland and genetic algorithms, or GAs. Holland had this idea. Could we simulate Darwinian evolution right there inside a computer? Part of the motivation was this observation, this feeling that self-organization and increasing complexity aren't just quirks. They might be like a fundamental force in the universe. Doyne Farmer called it a deep physical principle, maybe complementing things like entropy.
Okay, so how do you actually simulate Darwin's evolution using computer code? What does that look like?
Well, the basic process mirrors nature pretty closely. You start with a population of, say, potential solutions to a problem. These are represented like artificial genomes, often just strings of bits or maybe simple programs.
Right.
Then you need a fitness function. That's just a way to measure how good each solution, each individual is at whatever task you've set. Then the crucial part, selection. The fitter solutions get chosen to reproduce.
Not literally reproduce, obviously.
No, but they generate variations of themselves. They mate, often using a process called crossover, where you take parts of 2 parent genomes and swap them to create offspring. And you add in mutations, small, random changes to the code. Then you just repeat this cycle. Evaluate fitness, select the best, reproduce with variation over many generations.
So it's like natural selection, but acting on bits of information instead of biological organisms.
Exactly. You have the genotype, that's the underlying code, the program string, and you have the phenotype, that's the resulting behavior or form, how well it performs the task. Holland even developed his schema theorem, which sort of mathematically showed why this works, how useful chunks of code, these building blocks or schemas, tend to spread and combine through the population over time.
And the examples of what people actually evolved using GAs, some of them are pretty wild.
Oh, yeah. Richard Dawkins' biomorphs are a fantastic visual example. He started with these super simple stick figures defined by just a few genes. Then he used human unnatural selection. He just picked the ones he liked the look of on
He
screen.
was the environment, basically.
Right, he was the selection pressure. And
Yeah.
just by doing that, clicking on appealing shapes for like 29 generations, he evolved these incredibly complex insect-like creatures from just simple lines. It was a really powerful demo of how simple systems plus selection can generate surprising diversity.
From abstract lines to something looking like an insect. That's amazing.
Then John Koza took it way further with genetic programming. Instead of just evolving data strings, he used GAs to evolve actual working computer programs.
Like functional code.
Yeah. A classic example is evolving a program for an artificial ant to navigate a complex, winding trail marked with food pellets. He'd start with a population of random programs made from basic commands like move forward, turn left, if food ahead, and then select based on how well they followed the trail.
And it worked.
It worked remarkably well. He showed you could evolve surprisingly efficient programs, sometimes finding solutions humans wouldn't have thought of. Koza really championed crossover, the swapping of code chunks, as the key driver of innovation in his system.
And Robert Axelrod used GAs too, but for something more abstract, right? Like game theory.
Yes, he applied them to evolving strategies for the prisoner's dilemma game, that classic scenario where two players choose to cooperate or defect. Axelrod found that GAs were incredibly good at searching the huge space of possible strategies. They consistently discovered robust approaches, including variations of the famous simple TIT for TAT strategy, cooperate first, then do whatever the opponent did last time. It showed GAs could be used to explore complex interaction strategies, maybe even model things like cooperation in biology or international relations.
Wow, from a simple game to potentially modeling global politics.
Yeah.
And Danny Hillis, he used a kind of co-evolution with GAs, didn't he, with his connection machine work?
That's right. Hillis was trying to evolve very efficient programs called sorting networks, specialized circuits for sorting numbers quickly. The problem was the evolution kept getting stuck on pretty good but not optimal solutions.
So how did he fix that?
He introduced artificial parasites. These were other evolving programs whose only job was to find weaknesses in the sorting networks, to find sequences of numbers that the networks couldn't sort correctly.
So the sorters and the parasites were evolving against each other.
Exactly. It was an arms race. The sorting networks had to constantly evolve better defenses to survive the parasite attacks, and the parasites had to evolve cleverer attacks to find flaws. It's a perfect digital example of the Red Queen effect from biology. You have to keep running just to stay in the same place.
And did it work? Did it make the sorting networks better?
Much better. This co-evolutionary pressure forced the sorting networks to become much more robust and pushed them towards more optimal solutions. Hillis even made a prediction about punctuated equilibrium bursts of rapid change in evolution based on this, and working with Eric Lander, they found the surprising mathematical constant 1 over e squared related to how fast traits could spread.
Okay, so simulating evolution lets you create complex solutions without explicitly designing them. But what about moving beyond single programs or algorithms? What about building entire artificial worlds, ecosystems where things can live and interact?
That's the logical next step, isn't it? From individuals to environments. And Tom Ray's Tierra project is the absolute landmark here. He essentially built a digital ecosystem.
How did that work?
The organisms were very simple computer programs, written in a custom assembly language Ray designed. And they competed directly for the most fundamental computer resources: CPU processing time to run their code, and memory space to store it.
And what happened when you just let them loose in this digital world?
It became this vibrant, evolving digital biosphere. The programs, the organisms, they replicated, they mutated, and they evolved. Complex ecological interactions just emerged spontaneously.
Like what kind of interactions?
Well, he saw the evolution of parasites, smaller programs that couldn't actually replicate on their own code, but figured out how to borrow code snippets from larger host programs to make copies of themselves, often faster than the host could.
Seriously, digital parasites.
Yeah. And then, in response, he saw the counter-evolution of immunity. Host programs evolved ways to detect or resist these parasitic code invasions. You got this whole dynamic ecosystem, predator-prey, host-parasite relationships, emerging purely from programs competing for CPU cycles and memory.
That's incredible. It just happened.
It just happened. And Ray even found that when he deliberately turned off the mutation function in his system, diversity and evolution still occurred because of what he called sloppy replication.
Floppy replication.
Yeah, sometimes when these parasites were messing with host code, or even just due to random system glitches, bits of code would get changed or moved around accidentally. And sometimes these errors introduced new variations, functioning a bit like biological crossover or mutation, keeping evolution going. Ray made this great point about how hard it was to even understand these completely novel digital life forms, saying something like, what we see is what we know. Our understanding is kind of limited by the biological life we're familiar with.
And was anyone trying to create something even more fundamental, like simulating the basic chemistry of life, but artificially?
Steen Rasmussen's Venus project went in that direction. He built what he called an artificial chemistry. Instead of biological molecules, the basic components were simple computer instructions, like assembly language commands. He was partly inspired by early computer games like Core War, where programs literally battled for memory control.
So the elements were things like move data, add number, jump if zero.
Exactly, those were the basic building blocks. And Rasmussen explored how self-sustaining systems, maybe analogous to metabolic pathways, could emerge just from these instructions interacting within the computer's memory space.
And could these instruction sets start showing lifelike properties?
He found that different computational environments would emerge, sometimes sparse deserts with little activity, other times dense jungles where instructions were constantly interacting, copying, modifying each other. He provocatively suggested these weren't just simulations of chemistry, but maybe they were fundamentally alternative forms of reality themselves, built from computation.
Wow. Okay, so we've got evolution in code, entire digital ecosystems popping up. But A-life isn't only about what happens inside the computer screen, is it? It can also be about physical things, about robots moving in the real world.
Absolutely. That's the whole field of embodied A-life, and Rodney Brooks at MIT was a huge figure here. His approach was often called behavior-based robotics, or, maybe more strikingly, intelligence without representation.
Intelligence without representation. What does that mean? How's it different from, traditional AI?
Well, traditional AI, especially back then, often focused on building a single, really complex internal model of the world inside the robot's brain, like a map or a symbolic representation of everything around it. Then the robot would use that model to do complex top-down planning. Think about a chess program analyzing the board.
Right, calculating all the possibilities.
Brooks argued that's not how most living things work, especially simpler creatures like insects. They don't seem to have these detailed world models, so his approach was bottom-up. His robots didn't build complex internal representations. Instead, they had layers of very simple behaviors.
Like what?
Things like move forward, avoid obstacles, wander around, explore. Each layer was a simple perception action loop, reacting directly to sensor input. And these layers were stacked, with higher layers able to subsume or inhibit lower ones when needed. He called it the subsumption architecture.
Okay, so the complex behavior doesn't come from some master plan inside, but from how these simple reactive rules interact with each other and the environment.
Exactly. His robots, like Genghis, the six-legged walker, or the later Attila, they achieved surprisingly complex movements and tasks, walking over rough terrain, coordinating their legs, finding objects purely through the emergent interaction of these simple, layered reactive behaviors. They weren't calculating trajectories, they were just responding robustly to the world in real time. It was intelligence emerging from the interaction, not pre-planned inside.
And that kind of approach, building these simple reactive creatures, ties directly into studying natural animal behavior, right? Computational ethology.
It really does. By building artificial creatures with simple rules and seeing what behaviors emerge, you can gain insights into how natural systems might achieve similar results. Valentino Breitenberg's thought experiments, his vehicles, are another fantastic example here.
Well, those are the really simple conceptual robots.
Incredibly simple. Just imagine little vehicles with sensors, like light sensors, wired directly to their motors, their wheels. Maybe a sensor on the left speeds up the right wheel or slows it down. Just direct connections.
And they ended up looking like they had complex motivations.
Astonishingly so. Depending on just how you wired the sensors to the motors, excitatory connections, inhibitory ones, crossed connections, these utterly simple machines would exhibit behaviors that we, as human observers, instantly interpret in psychological terms, like fear turning sharply away from a light source, or love turning towards it and following it, or aggression.
Even though there was nothing inside programming fear or love.
Absolutely nothing. It was purely the result of the direct sensor motor wiring and the interaction with the environment. Brainberg used this brilliantly to question how we interpret behavior and maybe even the nature of consciousness. If a simple machine behaves in a way that looks like fear, on what basis do we deny that it is fear? It was almost like a physical Turing test for emotions.
That bottom-up idea, engineering simple local interactions to get complex global behavior, that really seems to be the connecting thread through so many of these early A-Life projects we've talked about.
It's totally the core A-life philosophy, yeah. And, it brings us to maybe one of the most controversial questions that bubbled up right from the start. Are computer viruses actually alive?
Right. This really came into focus with Fred Cohen's academic work on computer viruses programs specifically designed to replicate themselves and spread through computer systems.
And they certainly tick a lot of the boxes for life, don't they? They reproduce, they spread through their environment, the computer network, they consume resources, CPU time, disk space, and they can even evolve over time as they spread or as people write new variants.
And they draw power, essentially, from their environment, the computer system, which sounds kind of like how biological viruses hijack host cells to reproduce.
Exactly the analogy people drew. Cohen actually designed some early viruses and documented their spread precisely to study this phenomenon scientifically. And you had precursors like the Darwin game or Core War, where programs fought for memory, a kind of digital survival of the fittest. So the question became really pointed. Does showing these key lifelike behaviors mean they qualify as actual artificial life?
It's a really provocative question. A tough one.
It is. Their ability to replicate, spread, mutate, it's undeniably lifelike, especially compared to biological viruses. Some researchers, including Cohen himself, argued quite strongly that yes, they were a form of artificial life, full stop.
And others?
Others were more cautious, acknowledging they were very close, maybe analogous to biological viruses' incomplete life forms that need a host system, the computer, to carry out their life cycle, lacking their own, say, metabolism.
And of course, the ethical worries around malicious viruses are just immediate and obvious.
Oh, absolutely. The potential for creating uncontrollable, destructive digital entities was a serious concern right away. Doyne Farmer explicitly warned that as A-Life got more sophisticated, the implications could be huge, and we needed to think about the issues before we inadvertently created the equivalent of the bomb in the digital realm.
Were there discussions about beneficial viruses too?
There were, though it was controversial. Some people speculated about using self-replicating programs for useful tasks, like system maintenance or distributed computation. But others, like Eugene Spafford, strongly cautioned against it, arguing that the inherent risks of any self-replicating code spreading uncontrollably were just too high.
So it's clear that A-Life, right from its inception, wasn't just about the science. It immediately forced these deep philosophical reflections and raised pretty serious ethical questions about the power we might be unleashing.
Definitely. It just forces you constantly back to these fundamental questions. What is life at its core? Where does complexity come from? Self-organization? What about things like intelligence or maybe even consciousness? Is computation just a tool we use to study life, or could it be the actual medium, the substrate for entirely new forms of life?
That strong claim, the idea that life created in a computer could be just as real as biological life, it stops being just a philosophical debating point, doesn't it? These experiments were actively pushing at the boundaries of that very idea.
They really were. And the ethical side, thinking about control, about consequences, as Farmer pointed out, that just becomes more and more critical as the potential power of these systems grows. Thinking ahead is crucial.
Looking back at those early days, through the lens of our source, what were some of the really bold visions for the future that came out of this A-Life work?
Well, the sources definitely mention the potential for genuinely symbiotic relationships between humans and artificial creatures, not just seeing them as tools, but as entities we might interact with in complex ways. Maybe specialized robots for tasks like cleaning or gardening or construction.
Like Rodney Brooks's slightly whimsical vision of herds of artificial hippos building dams.
Exactly, that kind of thinking. There was also this grander idea put forward by people like Hans Moravec, too, of A-Life representing maybe the next level of organization in the universe, a potential merging, eventually, of biological life and technological life into something fundamentally new, maybe post-biological.
And perhaps the most provocative thought, the one that really sticks with you.
I think it's the idea that with A-Life, humanity might be the very first species on this planet to consciously, deliberately create its own evolutionary successors. That we are potentially jump-starting a process that could lead to forms of life, forms of intelligence, vastly different from our own, fundamentally changing our place in the cosmos. It's a mind-bending thought.
We've covered a huge amount of ground today, from those foundational logical views of von Neumann and Turing, through the amazing emerging complexity we saw in cellular automata, like the game of life, the power of simulated evolution and genetic algorithms.
Creating whole digital ecosystems like Tierra and Venus,
Yeah.
the embodied reactive intelligence of Brooks robots,
Right.
and even wrestling with whether computer viruses count as being alive.
Yeah. This deep dive into the origins of artificial life, it really shows how those early pioneers were using computation not just as a fancy calculator, but as this incredibly powerful microscope and even a kind of laboratory to explore the absolute bedrock principles of life, complexity, and self-organization.
Building it from the ground up, essentially.
And hopefully, listening to this, you've gained some real insight into where this field came from, a field that truly challenges our basic definition of what it means to be alive and explores those deep, deep connections between information, computation, and biology.
It really leaves you with a question that kind of lingers, doesn't it? After you sort of step back from the silicon and into the biological world, if life can emerge from different materials based on different kinds of rules, what completely unforeseen shapes might artificial life take in the future? And maybe more importantly, how might that change our relationship with the very concept of life itself?